Recording. Okay, welcome everyone. Let me see if I can share this now. Can you all see that? You can? Okay. As I said previously, this is there were several women artists I could talk about. Most of them only newly discovered, as we say. So I hope that you're able to read some of the other ones that I put up in that reference. And I hope that you're all getting those emails with all those references. If not, let me know somehow. Okay. I'm starting this with two pictures of two Australian women artists. As you'll note, both of them working outdoors, outside. The first one is a very genteel woman in the 1880s, outside with her son and sister. That's Ellis Rowan. And I'm not an artist, I will be talking about her, but the other one, Hilda Rix Nicholas, I won't be talking about. But I just love this picture of her at Bondi Beach in her, probably in her stockings and proper dress, surrounded by lifeguards. Oh wait, let me get this out of the way. Okay, there we go. And just to put us in the mood, I've put up this quotation by Miles Franklin, who was the author when she was only 16 of My Brilliant Career. Some of you may know that film, My Brilliant Career, with Judy Davis and Sam Neill. And she wrote this. This was wildly popular at the time, but this was in 1901. And she says, "It came home to me as a great blow that it was only men who could take the world by its ears and conquer their fate, while women, metaphorically speaking, were forced to sit with tied hands and patiently suffer as the waves of fate tossed them hither and thither." So this was just to put us in the mood of the situation in the late 19th century and into the 20th century for women in Australia, particularly. In 1900, Australia, which was always a male-dominated society, in Australia then, men outnumbered women about 110 to 100, as the population had been significantly shaped by men. First in the convict era during transportation, that was overwhelmingly male. And then with the gold rush and the increase of population, that too was largely male. And it was considered then this country that was made for men to dominate and to conquer. And when I talked about in my lectures on California women artists, it's the same in Australia, but even more. Women in this period were having to deal with the same societal structures. But Australian women were coming out of a long Victorian era that lasted well into the 1950s. So these strictures were even more pronounced. This is a slide with one of the artists we've been talking about. This is Jessie Trail over here at the National Gallery Art School in Melbourne in 1902. But let's talk about some of those strictures. One of the major hindrances for women as artists was the attitude about public versus private space, amateur versus professional. Men were allowed to operate in public spheres, while well into the 20th century, women were supposed to be confined to the domestic private world. Having a career of any kind was considered unseemly, making it difficult for women artists, especially, to find any places to exhibit their works, and most importantly, to gain access to academic artistic training. Women of a certain class could dabble in the arts, go on sketching outings, and become Sunday painters, but the idea of making a career of art and exhibiting in public was frowned upon. If they wanted to paint, there were prescribed subjects for women: motherhood, children, portraits, flowers, and still lifes. And from the 19th century, especially in British-tinged Australia, genteel women with a creative streak were supposed to paint china or do embroidery. Now, in Australia, though, the few art schools that existed in the late 1800s and into the 1900s did allow women to attend classes and to exhibit along with their classmates, but their chances of making a career of art, or any kind of career for that matter, were extremely restricted. Because the home society was the Britain of Queen Victoria, Australian women were even more hampered as artists than California women were, at least in terms of official institutional recognition. And while, as we shall see, women were the strongest pioneers of modernism in the 1920s and 30s, by the end of World War II, Australian men again appropriated the mantle of recognized artists of note. Most of the art we will be talking about in this period concerns a confrontation with modernism, as opposed to what others refer to as traditional art, meaning those academic styles that by the 19th century were conservative and established as mainstream art, naturalistic depictions with strongly delineated forms and composition representing academic training. The work of the so-called Impressionist painters that we talked about last week is about as close to real modernism as Australian art had become by the 1920s. And really the popular art was, on the one side, we see Arthur Streeton, remember, he who establishes the whole landscape trope, a motif of the Australian landscape, also was painting these kind of metaphysical or symbolic paintings, in this case, the spirit of the drought, which gave them an opportunity to include nude women in their depictions of the landscape. And on the other hand was the wildly popular Hans Huyssen, a South Australian German artist who painted these very rugged scenes of the outback of the landscape, with the eucalyptus in this case being these strong masculine kind of forms, and images of droving, that is sheep, herding the sheep. And these were, capturing the light in the landscape. And these became very comfortable images of the time. And he was very popular. Now, okay, I didn't put that one there. Okay. In this period, the reaction from the establishment from leading male artists to modernism was vehement. And we have the most popular or well-known printmaker of the time, who began life as an illustrator of what become beloved children's books, Blinky Bill and others. This is Norman Lindsay in his more salacious styles. Norman Lindsay was very much against what the Aussies call wowsers. That means prudish, puritanical kind of society. And so he paints these very risque and racy images. If any of you saw the film The Sirens, that's about Norman Lindsay, and it's where Elle Macpherson makes her famous nude introduction to film. So these are the kinds of things that Norman Lindsay was painting at the time, or printing at the time. And to get an example of how vehement this reaction was, in 1924, Norman Lindsay wrote this polemic, and I'm quoting here: "The creative mind, especially the masculine, existed apart from the mass mind, which, essentially feminine, constantly attacked it with the aid of such lesser breeds as Jews, Asians, and Africans. Modernist art and the war were but the most recent manifestations of these unending attacks upon the creative elite." really an appalling statement. But this is this is an attitude that prevailed, at least in these. He was trying to be provocative on one hand, but it's also the way things were. Now, less egregious comments accompanied questions about women artists. And this appeared in the Adelaide newspaper. Men and women are differently constituted. Women are more closely attached to the physical things of life, and to expect them to do some things equally as well as men is sheer lunacy. A great artist has to tread a lonely road. He becomes great only by exerting himself to the limit of his strength the whole time. I believe that such a life is unnatural and impossible for a woman. Unquote. So this was the attitude to women at the time. And I include here, this is Nora Heysen, who is Hans Heysen's daughter, the artist we just saw who was painting all the masculine eucalyptus. And it's about her that this article is referring to her. These are the kind of works that she was doing. She's a very interesting artist. And again, just recently sort of rehabilitated as an important figure. And I'm not going to be able to talk much about her, so I wanted to put these up here. So despite all of these hindrances and these attitudes, or perhaps because of them, a very intriguing and unexpected phenomenon happened in Australia. In the period from about 1910 into the 1940s, for reasons that will become a little clearer as we talk about the individual artists, women were demonstrably at the forefront of introducing Australia to true modernism in painting, and especially through printmaking. Last week, we saw how, let me just keep up now. Last week, we saw how men constructed the nationalist art as expressing masculine labor, constructing the myth of the Aussie worker, and focusing on a portrayal of the landscape as one conquered by men. Women artists confronting such a dominant stylistic program, if in a societal and a privileged economic situation allowed them to do so, felt that they had nothing to lose by exploring other, and in most cases, more advanced artistic directions. This is at least my interpretation of why women were at the forefront of bringing real modernism to the country in this period. Others, such as the Australian art historian Bernard Smith, opined that this phenomenon in the 1920s and 1930s, I love this one, was because so many men were lost or damaged in World War I, and that's where all of the talented and creative men went. So the only ones left to become truly avant-garde were the women. That's his reasoning. Whatever the reason, women produced the most advanced art in Australia up to the Second World War. And I'm quoting here Janine Burke, who wrote the first book on Australian women artists. The output of talented women artists working during this period far outstrips the contribution of their contemporaries in either Europe or America. Women's art emerges as Australia's special, though largely uncherished and unacknowledged province in the course of the 20th century art. It is an irony that in a country traditionally hostile to women, a number of gifted female artists have formed something akin to a movement, or at least a recognized phenomenon within Australian art history. This fact, the distinctions made between male and female spheres of influence, of course, leads us to one of the most defining societal elements with which women artists have had to contend everywhere, and that is gender politics. And excuse me, I'm quoting here another literary figure, British figure, Cyril Connolly, who in 1938 made this wonderful statement. Marriage can succeed for an artist only where there is enough money to save him from taking on uncongenial work and a wife who is intelligent enough to understand and respect the workings of the unfriendly cycle of the creative imagination. There is no more somber enemy of good art than the pram in the hall. And that's the end of the quote. I would say that despite the sexism of this statement, this dilemma applied most urgently to creative women, since they have always been meant to be the domestic ones. And it's interesting that the Australian women who we're going to be discussing were probably, because of these attitudes, very few of them married. I think 2 of the women we're talking about today married. They either married other artists or in some way kindred spirits. Some of them married very late in life, and in most cases married into a financially secure situation, which allowed them the freedom to concentrate on their art. The majority of the women we'll be talking about today remained single, either trained with an artist parent or were supported by their family. Some had companionate or lesbian relationships with other women, often with other artists. You will also note how many of these women remain tied to their families, ending up as a single woman taking care of elderly parents. This struck me very, very strongly because this wasn't necessarily an aspect of California women artists, for example, but in many of the cases of the women we're talking about, they had to interrupt their careers or had to make changes in their lives because they were at home taking care of elderly parents in one way or another. And in Australia, concepts of class play a bigger part in art politics than they did in California, at least. Because of their isolation as a British colony, far from the home culture, Australia was much more tied to the Victorian niceties of the British Empire. There was less possibility for anyone outside of the upper middle class to be allowed into the corridors of artistic training. The women I'm showing here are 2 of the artists we'll be talking about. And as you can see, one of them came out as a debutante. And this is Grace Cossington Smith, who was from a very well-to-do English family that had moved to Australia when she was born in Australia. So most of them came from these good families. And almost mandatory among these good families in Australia was that they sent their children to England, or they traveled there as a family to study, and in some cases traveling further afield. Australians with any aspirations in this period to cultural education, it became almost a necessity. And I think that's why they became such enthusiastic travelers, as Australians remain to be today. Anywhere you go, you're going to find an Australian there visiting or living. Lastly, I want to mention the critical importance to Australian artists of international magazines and journals with the reproductions of artworks. This is a topic very dear to my heart, as I think that a lot of art of artists in these cultures on the periphery gain their knowledge of overseas developments and of avant-garde art through reproductions in journals, which were readily available in Australia by this time. So first, I want to focus on the best of the earlier, more traditional women artists, because this one story especially epitomizes all of these factors. She represents, as Janine Burke comments, quote, a hybrid mixture of Victorian gentility, eccentricity, and extraordinary toughness. and this is Ellis Rowan, who was born Marion Ellis Rowan, but chose in her professional life to use a more masculine sounding name, her middle name, Ellis. She was born in Melbourne and became a well-known popular artist in her time. She was raised by a well-known botanist father in genteel privilege and had access to his internationally famous garden at their home. And it was here that she developed her skills in observational painting. She became one of Australia's most adventurous and talented natural history artists, specializing in flowers and birds, and occasionally insects. In 1873, she married a military man she had met while wandering the galleries of Melbourne's National Gallery of Victoria. He was himself a keen botanist who supported Rowan's desire to paint in nature. While living back in his native New Zealand, Rowan was encouraged by her husband to develop skills as a wildflower painter, and extraordinary for the time, even after she had had a child, he insisted that she travel away from home to further her studies and her art. She was, as far as we can tell, untrained academically. She may have had a few art lessons while in London, but talented and enthusiastic, she rapidly emerged as a competent artist and began winning important art prizes in Australia and overseas for these kinds of depictions of native flora. This angered the purist art world, which regarded her work as flower painting, belonging perhaps in science museums, but not in art galleries. And so these ideas, these attitudes about the academic hierarchies of what paintings were more important, narrative painting, history painting, and then down the line, the lesser forms, still prevailed, especially among a conservative art society as the established art world was in Australia at the time. The reality is that Ellis Rowan's work crossed the boundaries between art and natural history illustration. Much of her work is of a very high standard in both these disciplines. Her studies of flowers and birds were often set in context with the environment being done in a sketch-like style. Rowan became obsessive about her work and her endeavors to find new subjects, and traveled everywhere on her own, leaving her son with her husband or with her family in Australia. Her working conditions in Western Australia and North Queensland were difficult. Just imagine, this is still in the Victorian era, so she's doing this in the 1880s into the 1910s. She travels to New Guinea, where the conditions were even worse. Imagine traveling to New Guinea in the 1910s as a 70-year-old woman. And these are examples of some of the images that she produced there of flora that was not known up until this time. So this was really bringing an important information on a scientific level, but also very artistic. In 1898, she wrote about her travels in her book, A Flower Hunter in Queensland and New Zealand. It was very popular, after which she became known internationally as the Flower Hunter. And despite winning several gold medals judged by international artists against some of Australia's leading male artists, a disdain for her ability, artistry, and capacity due to her gender resulted in a bias against her art that lasted for decades. Her artistic archive, for example, is housed in the National Library of Australia, not at the National Gallery. And the most striking, let me go back. The most striking example of this bias against Rowan as a woman and a flower painter occurs at Melbourne's Centennial International Exhibition in 1888, where she was awarded top prizes. Other entrants included celebrated painters such as Louis Bouvalot and Tom Roberts, who we talked about last week. Her success ruffled the feathers of the art world, which led to a letter of protest from the Victorian Artists' Society. At the time, so-called flower paintings executed in watercolor were not deemed to be on the same level as narrative oil paintings. And I'm sure that gender had to have been a factor in this outrage. After she was internationally known as the flower painter, she worked with an American illustrator, Alice Lounsbury. The two first corresponded while Rowan was hospitalized in New York after she contracted the flu. This news was heard around the city, and Lounsbury, a huge admirer of Rowan, brought a hand-picked box of wildflowers to the hospital alongside a card reading, "From one flower seeker to another and an admirer of your work." Rowan was so touched by this gesture that the two became friends despite their 25-year age difference. And in the next 4 years, the two traveled over the southeastern United States in search of native plants and published 3 books together: A Guide to the Wildflowers, A Guide to the Trees, and Southern Wildflowers and Trees. And she always tried to concentrate on native species in whatever country she was in. In 1923, a year after her death, Rowan's entire archive of 900 plus paintings were offered to the Australian government, the purchase of which was debated in Parliament. They were eventually purchased for £5,000, half the asking price. But because there had been such an outcry by conservative critics about this outlay for flower painting, most of the works were farmed out to obscure embassies or government offices around the world. So this is the kind of situation that exists in this. The art world was extremely conservative and entrenched in that kind of conservatism. There wasn't that same idea of being a bohemian artist at this time, or at least not within the established circles. So now on to the women of modernism. Excuse me. Who will also demonstrate levels of pugnacity, audacity, and perseverance. Probably the single female artist known to most Australians today is Margaret Preston. She was born Margaret Rose McPherson in Adelaide. She moved to Sydney in 1885, where her family were very supportive of her artistic activities. She studied in Melbourne at the National Gallery Art School with Frederick McCubbin, the one we talked about last week, from 1889 to 1894. And she was already teaching art by the 1890s and taking on private students. She had to return to Adelaide at this time because of familiar responsibilities to take care of her mother after her father had died in that year. While already quite outspoken and opinionated, she was ambitious enough that she focused on still lifes at first. That was considered an appropriate subject for women painters. One student described her personality even then: a red-headed little firebrand of a woman who was not only an excellent painter, but a most inspiring teacher. And you can see now this one is 1915, still done in a rather soft, kind of almost post-impressionist style. And this is what her work looks like after she's been to Europe and comes back, a much bolder idea, even in her still lifes. When her mother died in 1903, she and another artist friend traveled to Europe for the first time. They stayed until 1907, studying first in Germany, in Munich, which they didn't find appealing, then to Paris, which suited Margaret much more. And here she discovered the work of Cézanne, Gauguin, and especially of Japanese art, Japanese prints, and began to simplify her paintings, preferring these asymmetrical compositions. And you can see that in this painting, the table is cut off in an asymmetrical way. There's an idea of these almost geometric forms. So we have the curtain in the background and then the line of this table. So this is quite deliberate. And here you really can see in this print the influence of Japanese art, so much so that she signs with a monogram that's very much like what the Japanese artists were doing in their prints. So she had seen this work by this time. She always maintained that she wasn't impressed by German art, but her simplification of forms, as we'll see in a minute, seems to me to mirror much of the 1920s German art. But maybe that's just me and my interest in German art. But I've always thought that she gained as much from German art as she had from French. She returned to Adelaide in 1907 and set up a studio and took in private students. But it was only after returning to Paris in 1912 that she recognized the decorative possibilities of art. She went there with one of her former students, a woman who became a fast friend and an important potter in Australia, Gladys Raynell. I wish I had more time to talk about her. Both of them were in London in time to see the 1912 Post-Impressionism show organized by Roger Fry. Roger Fry was an important member of the Bloomsbury Group. The Bloomsbury Group included Virginia Woolf and Virginia Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell. Vanessa Bell is the painter of this room at the second Post-Impressionist exhibition, in which you can see on the walls those works, the famous works by Matisse, this was the first show in England in which the British critics and public saw post-impressionist Fauvist works from the continent, from Europe, from Paris. And this cover, designed by Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, shows that they also had some knowledge by this time of perhaps Cubism and definitely Expressionism. So Britain was a little more behind than the avant-garde did not reach British shores until later. So think about the fact that Matisse had been painting these a decade earlier, and they were only just beginning to see Impressionist works in England by this time. But it was there that they became enthralled, both Macpherson, who becomes Margaret Preston, and Raynell, with the Japanese art they saw, as well as Gauguin and Cézanne. With the outbreak of war, Macpherson and Raynell moved from Paris. They went back to Paris, and then they came back to England, where they stayed throughout the war. Margaret exhibited at the Royal Academy, the New English Art Club, and the Society of Women Artists. 2 years later, in 1916, so in the middle of World War I, she enrolled at the Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts as a student of pottery, along with Raynell, at the same time developing her interest in fabric printing and dyeing, basket weaving, and most importantly, various techniques of printmaking. She also met all the members of the Bloomsbury Group, including Roger Fry and Vanessa Bell. And so this is one of Raynell's potteries, a kookaburra teapot. So of course they're putting these motifs, these Australian motifs onto pottery. And this is her mug of dogs and cats. And McPherson was doing similar kinds of pottery. Again, this teapot with boiling billies and gum trees shows that she's by this time interested already in motifs that have to do with Australia. And as we'll see, that becomes really important to her later on. But she's also learning these printmaking techniques. And this is very much like the kinds of prints that were being made in England at the time. And as we'll see, when she gets home, she produces a different kind completely. In 1919, Preston went to America for an exhibition at the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. On her way back to Australia, she met her future husband, William George Bill Preston, a recently discharged second lieutenant of the Australian Imperial Force. Back in Adelaide, they were married in December of 1919, at which time she wrote a false birth date on her marriage certificate to make herself 8 years younger than her husband. Bill had a placid temperament that complemented Margaret Preston's assertive personality, and they were devoted to each other throughout their marriage. One of her husband's friends noted that Bill seemed to regard it as a national duty to keep his beloved Margaret happy and artistically productive. He was a successful businessman and he was a company director for several big Sydney firms. So Margaret Preston she marries only at 45. He brought her financial security, encouraged her art, and even traveled with her. At times, she traveled now voraciously and everywhere. And from this point on, Margaret Preston is committed to defining Australian art style, a national art. She and her husband settled in Mossman, a bayside suburb on the North Shore of Sydney. North Shore is code for upper class living or upper middle class living. So living on the North Shore is kind of means you've made it in a way. Here she began to make prints, specifically woodcuts, that would add to her fame. She was really reintroducing this technique, eschewing the tonal prints then so popular. And think about those Norman Lindsays that we saw. She's focusing here on color, bold lines, and simplified forms. She made these, the prints were in black and white, and then she hand colored them. So these are not done with several blocks of printing. All of these, the images that she focuses on now are either native plants, as in Sturt's desert peas and Christmas bells. I saw in an auction catalog that this particular print is now selling for $22,000. So it is remarkably popular. It's seen everywhere, and you get postcards of it and calendars and all of that. So these became quite well known. She also did many scenes of Sydney and the landscape around where they lived. Again, not as separate blocks for each color. And here we see the bridge as seen from North Shore, 1932. The Sydney Harbour Bridge was built between 1927 and 1932, and it was an immensely important event. And as we'll see, many artists focus on this effort, and this important motif shows up many, many times. Now, these prints were very popular and contributed to her fame. But to me, my favorite works are her large-scale paintings of the mid-1920s, in which you see her move toward decorative flatness, geometric shapes, She said that this was a lot of this was influenced by the work of the French artist Léger. But to my mind, I also see some influence of German art of the Bauhaus period. Um, in any case, Australia had never seen anything like this kind of painting, and accompanied by Preston's fiery personality and assertive promotion of her desire for a modern Australian style, she became well known and exhibited into the 1930s. She wrote many articles and essays for modern art journals such as Art in Australia. And these, I think, are very much like what she may have seen at the Post-Impressionist show in London, and also, I think, from magazines showing the work of German artists in the 1920s and 30s. So and you'll see these are always native plants. This is eucalyptus, and she is doing here the Banksias, but I love the flapper. She's my favorite. By the late 1920s into the 1940s, she began to adapt Aboriginal designs from bark paintings, into her own works. And she wrote about this, quote, "In wishing to rid myself of the mannerisms of a country other than my own, I have gone to the art of a people who had never seen or known anything different from themselves. These are the Australian Aboriginals, and it is only from the art of such people in any land that a national art can spring." So we begin to see in her work, especially the colors of the landscape, and also references to what motifs she sees in bark paintings, Aboriginal bark paintings. She writes of this: "If Australia is ever to have a typical art of its own, the less it sees of mediocre English or European works, the better." Now, the question here is, first of all, where is she seeing this? Because there is no Aboriginal art that is work that's on bark anywhere except in the outback, in the Aboriginal communities, or in ethnographic anthropology museums. There was no Aboriginal art considered as valid for an art museum until the late 1950s. And as we'll see next week, what we consider Aboriginal art does not develop until the 1970s. But she's using these motifs. She's picking up, even in this one, Aboriginal glyph. This is late 1958, where she's really taking these forms and applying them to her Western style of painting. So we can see the effects of her travels into inland Australia and her study at the anthropology museums. Now, today, of course, we consider this an appropriation of Aboriginal imagery. As one recent critic wrote, Preston's fascination with Indigenous art coexisted with a staggering ignorance and insensitivity to cultural trespass. And this, of course, is one of the most contentious issues that continues today. But while contemporary accounts will point out that she, like most every other Australian of her class and era, never thought that this establishment of a national Australian style based on Aboriginal motifs should come from Aborigines themselves, we must keep in mind that no Australian was looking at Aboriginal designs as artistic until Margaret Preston did. What Aboriginal pieces she could see were available only in these ethnographic collections. I'm not even clear what Aboriginal work she would have been able to see. But she continues in this direction well into the 50s. And I love this one. I think this does show some sympathy, at least, for the Aboriginal situation, in which we have this white blonde angel expelling the natives from Eden. This is the Eden in which, okay, there's the rabbit-proof fence behind them. There are koalas out there, and it's surrounded by native plants. But this was at a time, remember, when Aborigines were not even considered citizens. Okay, so Preston's popular introduction of and promotion of woodcuts and other printing techniques in the 1920s had a great influence on another artist who would become a well-known figure in the Australian world of design, fashion, and the theater. And this is Thea Proctor. This is another style, another direction of modernity and modernism. Indeed, Thea Proctor would work with Preston in Sydney for a time, and there she learned the technique of woodcut and other printmaking from her. They had joint shows until they had a falling out when Preston, according to legend, threw cake in Proctor's face, having learned that Proctor's art had been purchased by the art museum over her work. They never spoke again and avoided each other at exhibitions. Proctor's brand of modernism was in no way bohemian, although just as removed from male-dominated directions as Preston's. And here we see she came from a rather genteel country family. Here she is at 21, and a portrait of her by George Lambert, who was another expat Australian artist in London, to whom Proctor was very attached to him and his family. She had a rocky childhood, living mostly with her grandmother. Somehow she managed to get to London in 1903, and although quite poor, managed to meet all the glitterati of the city. She worked as a model and made a living designing fans. She knew Charles Conder, the artist we talked about last week, who was the one who suggested that she paint fans as a way to make a living. She was always interested in fashion and the theater, and attached herself to the household of George Lambert, with whom she remained friends for some 30 years. And here we have a painting by her, a watercolor, and you can see that she's most interested in fashion, and this is one of the few remaining of her silk fans. And the subject, you can see that it's very much a kind of fantasy of old-fashioned costumes. She was very interested in historic fashion and collected costumes when she could. She was also a master drafts person. She was very interested in drawing, and these are pictures that she made, drawings that she made at the theater. All her life, she was to carry with her the modernist precepts and influences she absorbed from figures such as Clive Bell, another one of the Bloomsbury group, and the spectacles such as the Ballet Russe, and exhibitions. She too saw the post-impressionist exhibitions. Aside from a return to Australia in 1913, she was to remain in England throughout her 20s and 30s, during which she learned to make lithographs as a way, again, to have reproducible images that she could sell. She worked for magazines and journals, and these are the kinds of images, again, an emphasis on, in this case, hats, on millinery, and kind of fantasy images that would appear sometimes in children's books. She was fascinated with creating these fantasies of another era. She returns to Sydney in 1921, and it was there that she begins to make these kinds of woodcuts while she was working with Preston. Unlike Preston, her prints were always finished and polished. There's no evidence, for example, of the wood grain. They too were black and white prints, and then they were hand colored. And you can see here in this swing, this emphasis on fashion of a different era, and creating these rather Arcadian scenes. These are also reproduced ad infinitum nowadays in Australia, and appear on calendars all the time. Her most prolific output was for Sidney Ure Smith's The Home magazine, one of the most sophisticated and stylish design journals and Australian lifestyle publications of the 1920s and 30s. It was aimed at middle-class Australian women and the lifestyle aspirations of an increasingly affluent urban middle class. So its articles and artwork reflected the dawn, as one critic writes, of modernism in Australia, with a focus on holiday destinations, home decorating, fashion, cosmetics, cultural events, and other amusements of the independent and modern woman. It was a perfect vehicle for Thea Proctor's ideas and designs, as it featured glamorous women living active, modern lives, and an emphasis too on the theater. So this is the original watercolor for the cover of The Home in 1935. Proctor lived modestly, but with an elegance sorely lacking in most of Australia well into the 1960s. She made her own clothes and complained bitterly about the lack of interesting fabric that she could get in Australia. And she lived into the 1960s, continued to make drawings, prints, and watercolors until the end. She died in 1966. Oh, these are some more of her covers for The Home. And here you see the kind of broad areas of color. So she preferred actually working in woodcut, making these images of languorous women quite often. Now, another direction in printmaking introduced into Australia by a female artist can be seen in the etchings of Jessie Trail. Here she is proofing and etching by subdued light, 1920, and in a portrait of her by another woman artist at the time, her friend Dora Wilson, in 1937. Trail studied at the National Gallery School and then went to Europe. And in London, she worked with the etcher Frank Brangwyn. And here she learned a technique that was unique to Brangwyn at the time by creating depth by wiping off only some of the ink and making what were considered radically large prints. These were much bigger than most etchings at the time would have been. She then studied also, she learns from Brangwyn this emphasis on industrial sites and on the geometric possibilities of designing these images based on contemporary construction. She then studied in Paris at one of the printmaking academies, Colarossi, and in 1909 she returned to Australia, to Melbourne, and brought with her an etching press. And here we see examples of some of the work she did when she returned. In the case of Drinking Man, this is reminiscent of the work she found in France. And in Tangled Tea Tree, we begin to see one of her two areas of concern as subjects. The first was an environmental consciousness. In these two pieces, this one called Beautiful Victims, and you see that there are two lumbermen here in the picture cutting down these trees. What they're doing is ring barking them. Ring barking is the way that Australians cut down trees or kill trees before they cut them down. I've seen this all over the place. I've never heard of it anywhere else. Perhaps it does happen, but That's what's happening here. They're ring barking. And so she's concentrating on landscapes, but with this message of lamenting the destruction of the Aboriginal forests by lumbering. In her series Man and Nature from 1914, again, she shows here the influence of Japanese prints with these abstracted decorative forms. This is number one, The Gift, very much like a Japanese print. And here, this is The Sacrifice, in which these white forms are dead trees. So this is a real interest of hers. The other preferred subject, stemming from her studies with Brangwyn, was industrial images, spurred by the excitement again of surrounding the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. She traveled up to Sydney quite often to report and draw and then print images of the construction of the bridge. There's an accuracy in her industrial drawing. And again, these are large size etchings, somewhat Japanese inspired, particularly when we see this one, the Great Arch, that looks very much like some Japanese prints, or even the Whistlers that we talked about last time as well. And this emphasis on the geometric forms. This one reminds me almost of a Franz Klein, one of the abstract expressionist artists in America in the 1950s. So there's this emphasis on a concentration between a solid mass of concrete and this intricate lacework of iron made for a play of light and shade. And she writes of this, in years to come, when we dash over the bridge in our taxi or take a walk across to see our harbor, we who have watched it progress and sketched or photographed its parts will feel with these workmen a sort of pride of possession. It will be our bridge too. She wrote that in 1929. So her modernity in etching is evident when compared to the kind of art that the leading male printmaker was doing at the same time. And so I put up again Norman Lindsay and his images of the crucifixion of Venus, which was just his excuse to make another voluptuous nude, but he's lamenting the prudishness, supposedly, of Victorian society. So this is the kind of stuff that he's doing. At the same time, Jessie Trail is producing those very aesthetic images. Another independent woman, great friends with Jessie Trail, was Violet Teague. And I love this picture of her late in life at her property, putting up a flag. In conjunction with Trail and other female artists, Teague had also studied intently Japanese print techniques, but she began as a portrait painter. And this is the one that Betty Churcher talks about in the video that I sent you the link to. Very simplified forms. Obviously, again, she had been studying Japanese prints, but she began her success as a portrait painter. And in, where is it? Okay. In conjunction with Trail and others, she produced a copy of an illustrated Japanese book called Nightfall in the Tea Tree. And I have a copy here. Oop, let me see if I can, no, never mind, of this book. And I wanted to talk about her simply because I've loved this book for so long. And it's considered one of the first Australian artist books and the earliest known example of color relief printing in the country. This hand-bound book of color woodblock prints with letterpress text was produced by these artists at Teague's home in Melbourne. The book itself is a remarkable tribute to Japanese printmaking techniques. Teague was introduced to during her time as a student in Europe and the UK, and is a very early example of this kind of woodcut illustration in Australia. And this is about as far as the kind of Art Nouveau interest in printing gets in Australia at the time. Now back to painting, and one of probably the most enigmatic and interesting, exciting figures at the time in the Sydney modernist scene, and this is Grace Cossington Smith. Grace Smith was born at Neutral Bay on the North Shore into an affluent English family, the second of 5 children. She had a quite comfortable background. Cossington was the name of the town in England where the family came from. The extended name Grace Cossington Smith appears on her baptism entry, and her mother encouraged her to adopt it as a part of her identity as an artist. She began actively using it in her 20s as her preferred way of being recognized personally and professionally. The family lived in the newly created suburb of Turramurra, where they built a house named, of course, Cossington. And it's here that Grace would live from 1914 for the next 65 years. She attended art classes with Dattilo Rubo in Sydney. Antonio Dattilo Rubo was not that great an artist, but he was apparently a very good teacher, allowing his students to explore their own directions and emphasizing color. And most importantly, he introduced his students to reproductions of the art of Van Gogh and Cezanne, showing them illustrations in books. And this greatly impressed Grace for these revelations. In 1912, she traveled to Europe, attending some art classes in England and Germany, but apparently unaware of postmodernist shows there. And more importantly, it was that she saw his Dattilo Rubo's approach to what he knew of Van Gogh and Cezanne. And it's this kind of splotchy application of color and the impression of dappled light that she seemed to have recognized. Now, her father builds her a small studio in the garden for her to paint in. And it was here that she painted the sock knitter, this one on the right, a study of her sister seated at Cossington knitting socks for the World War I effort. And she exhibited this work in 1915, and it's been described as perhaps the first fully post-impressionist work painted in Australia. And by that we mean this emphasis on pattern and color, an emphasis on color theory with these large areas of the blue and the orange in the background, and these flattened shapes. And again, the emphasis always on the depiction of color in large areas. And here in this earlier, in a later, portrait, we see that splotchiness and that dappling and application, sometimes with a palette knife, of areas of color that she had learned from Dattilo Rubo. Despite appearing as a pampered, quiet, ladylike amateur, Smith was bolder in her work than any of those described as modernists by Bernard Smith in his book. As the article in the Sydney Morning Herald says, that I sent you the link to, no one before or since has cast such an avant-garde art career from the North Shore, landing her with what marketers call an image problem. Proper old lady painter, nice. But she was friends with the only other color-laden modernists in Sydney, that is Roy de Maistre and Roland Wakelin. Now, I usually would not bring this up, but one of the important aspects of these men and Grace's connection with them is that they were both gay. And we'll see that other male artists make a reference to this. And in that case, they were considered as outsiders. They were considered as feminine. And so their approach to color and color theory and applying these to their art was considered in the same category as the women artists of the time. And it was in that light that they, these are Wakeland's. And you can see here, he's emphasizing the bridge as well. And again, this interest in Cezanne-esque kind of geometric forms and color. So Grace was aware of their work as well. And by the 1920s, friends who had cars would drive her into the countryside. But most of her best paintings were derived from her immediate environment. And she, more than any other, is now known for her paintings of the Sydney Harbor Bridge. This is, as I said, there was immense excitement about this, and there must have been 100 artists standing around the bridge while it was being constructed. And this one was probably her best known work, 1930, just as it's about to finish. And you can see here her application of her ideas of color, this kind of luminescence around the arch itself, this sense of energy and excitement, and these flattening of the geometric surfaces all around. She's today recognized, as one critic says, as one of the greatest Australian artists of the first half of the 20th century. Yet, at the time, like that of many female artists, her work was marginalized and unacknowledged. Smith's painting of the Sydney Harbor Bridge celebrates it as a powerful symbol of technology and modernity. She did at times teach, and here she is teaching, this is her, at Turramurra Boys School at the time the bridge was being built. And it's wonderful to see that they're actually making some kind of mural of the bridge itself. And she begins to change her style, but always emphasizing color and pattern. This is a set of screens, again, based on local native art, native vegetation. And I love this one of pumpkins with these various shades and hues of green. I think that's really fascinating. And so she's doing this all from her house in Turramurra, just her immediate environment. Here again, the lacquer room, an emphasis on red, of a cafe in town. And this is a corner of her bedroom done in yellow. And men were and then later on, we'll talk about this in a minute. She really had a few shows, but was really not known much at all until the 1960s, when a young curator finds her work of the bridge and wants to find out what's happened to her, goes to her house and finds stacked against the wall hundreds and hundreds of paintings, including these two, which are nearly abstracted. So by the 1930s, she's making these kinds of paintings. And these are, to me, extraordinarily modern for the time. And men were noticing that these women seem to be threatening the status quo. James MacDonald, a leading conservative art critic and former director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, wrote in 1932 that since the war, there had been a tremendous intrusion of women painters. They had always painted badly, very slick as students, but as soon as they got away from their instructors, they fell off and eventually disappeared. A year later, this same critic, MacDonald, wrote that unless real painters speak up for themselves and write art, the women and their near men abettors, now who are they talking about? Near men abettors, that's Wakeland and Demist, will ruin both. The feminists are in the majority and content if fashion, be it ever so trivial, be carried on the voices. Its lack of worth troubles them not at all. So we have to keep in mind how intensely reactionary and conservative Australian art society was until very, very recently. In 1928, at the age of 36, Cossington Smith held her first solo art exhibition at the Grover Galleries. From 1932, she would hold a further 18 solo exhibitions. She would also participate in many group exhibitions and be awarded the Order of the British Empire, an OBE, and appointed an officer of the Order of Australia. So there were accolades at the time, and then nothing until she was rediscovered in the late 1960s by Daniel Thomas. In 1973, there was a major retrospective exhibition of Cossington Smith's work, curated by Daniel Thomas, at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and tours nationally in all mainland states. And some of you may have listened to that tape of her, the oral history. I have never heard a more posh Australian accent than the one she has there. It's very old-fashioned. She wrote at the time, "My chief interest, I think, has always been color, not flat, crude color. It must be color within color. It has to shine. Light must be in it. It is no good having heavy, dead color. The room is in my home here." She's talking about that yellow room. Sunlight did not come in a definite way, but the whole room seemed to be full of light, which is what I want to do more than the actual sunlight. I feel that even the shadows are subdued light, and they must have light in them as well as the light parts. So a very intriguing figure, and again, attached to family. Why am I having such trouble with this? Okay. Another interesting woman, very avant-garde, is Dorothea Foster Black, always known as Dorrit Black. Another woman like Preston from Adelaide, another who never married, but became a mother figure for younger artists in her later years. She died at only 60 in a car accident. She first studied in South Australia, then went to England in 1910 with her parents, then came back to study in Sydney with the venerable Julian Ashton. She painted at first in acceptably traditional oils until she went back to England and Paris in the mid-1920s. In London, she was bowled over by the color lino cuts of Claude Flight, the most advanced of the British printmakers and the master of the new medium of lino cut. And of course, I had to be reminded that it's a new medium because linoleum was a fairly new product, had only been around since the 1890s, and in the shape and production that are used for lino cuts, it didn't really come out until the 1910s. And she went on then, after studying with Claude Flight, she returns to Sydney to introduce lino cuts to her students. And these are the kinds of work she's making as lino cuts. She then went back to Paris and studied with André Lotte, an early proponent of a modified cubism. The modified cubism associated with what we call the School of Paris. This was a brand of much more colorful, faceted shapes, focusing on illumination and luminescence, but not the analytical cubism of Picasso in the 1910s. And now Dorrit, along with her friend, another Australian modernist pioneer, Grace Crowley. Oh, and I'll go back here. Brings this style back to Australia, a kind of modified cubist breakdown of forms, and applies this to landscape. And these are some more that she was doing into the 30s. An emphasis on muted colors at this point. So she now begins to teach in Sydney. She had one woman shows there in the late 20s and 30s and helped form a group called the Group of Seven, which included Grace Crowley, as you see here. This is Grace Crowley's response to Demoiselle d'Avignon, the Picasso's painting, in which we see sailors and women. I guess these are supposed to be prostitutes. I'm not quite sure what her message was here, but you can see that they've obviously adapted something of Lot style and other Cubist directions to their own. And she also was working with Roy de Maistre and Roland Wakelin. She traveled once again to Europe, Black did, with her aging mother in 1934, then returned to live in Adelaide for the rest of her life. And in the 1930s, she made some of her greatest lino cuts, again, some black and white, some hand colored, and in these really these forms that are simplified shapes. And in the 1930s, the Gallery of New South Wales purchased this painting by Black Miramond. She became deeply involved in local politics and socialist campaigns. She exhibited regularly in Melbourne and Sydney and wrote for the Adelaide Press on art and also political topics. She abandoned her Christian Science religion in later life and wrote poetry about being unmarried and having religious doubts. I like the way she is described in one of her biographies. Plump, dignified, black-haired, and well-groomed, she was regarded as a mother figure by younger artists. A memorial exhibition was held at the Society of Arts in 1952, but her outstanding role as a pioneer and proselytizer of modernism in Australia was then largely overlooked. End of quote. And in my final figure, I'm looking at another overlooked woman. This is Clarice Beckett. Clarice Marjorie Banks Beckett was an Australian artist and key member of the Australian tonalist movement, known for her subtle, misty landscapes. She comes out of Melbourne. She was born and raised in the country, was seen as extremely shy from a young age, but bright and artistic. After the family had moved to Melbourne, she did study at the National Gallery School under McCubbin again, and then for 9 months attended the rival school of the art theorist Max Meldrum. Now, Meldrum was a very controversial outlier in the Australian art world, who propounded his own tonalist painting system drawn from scientific principles. He was essentially, on one level, opposed to modernism, but this was his brand of a kind of modernist style. He also is the one who is quoted above with the idea that there's no such thing as the possibility of a great woman painter, that's sheer lunacy. Nonetheless, Beckett was one of his best students, and they were derided as Meldrumites by critics, but they did have group exhibitions, and Beckett did show there in 1919, 1920. Beckett never left Victoria and rarely traveled outside Melbourne, much of her adult life being spent caring for her ailing parents at their home in the Bayside suburb of Beaumaris. While she did socialize with other artists and had a long-standing affair with the artist Percy Leeson, her life was rather cosseted, with little support from her family. In fact, her father threw away many of her paintings as being unfinished. In a recent essay I read in the The New Yorker by John McPhee, I learned a new word, which I think really applies to this style of painting. It's scumble or scumbling. Scumbling is a delicate final layer that painters have used to give their subjects the appearance of being seen through mist. Webster's Second International defines it as a verb to render less brilliant by covering with a thin coat of opaque or semi-opaque color applied with a nearly dry brush. So as a noun, a softened effect produced by scumbling. And you can see in her paintings, in Beckett's paintings, these nearly abstracted forms as if seen, still referring to nature, but really reducing it to these misty forms. She died at 48, having contracted pneumonia while caught in a rainstorm. As with so many other artists we've talked about, she was almost completely unknown until rediscovered by a young woman, Rosalind Hollandrake, who found that hundreds of her works had been stored in a barn where 2/3 of them had been more or less destroyed. Now she has been championed as one of the greatest modernists in Australia. And I'll end this talk with her image, Solitude, which I just find fascinating, wonderful. To the end, just remember that all these women were creating these works after being abroad, most of them, or by seeing reproductions of modernist art. There were not even any Impressionist paintings seen in Australia until 1939, and I think that all of them, in their own way, deserve the moniker given to Elizabeth Warren by Mitch McConnell. Nevertheless, she persisted. So that's the end. Yeah. Okay. So, do we have any questions? No?
Mm-mm.
Okay. I did want to remind you of that the article I sent later, that one about the Herald exhibition. This is an example of how conservative Australia was. In 1939, Keith Murdoch, that's our friend Rupert Murdoch's father, brought to Australia a collection of Impressionist paintings from his collection, or he had found them, okay, and they were brought for an exhibition. The gallery, the National Gallery of Victoria refused to show them. This is Impressionist, Cezanne, Pissarro, there was Dali, there were a few surrealists as well. I think there were 57 paintings. Anyway, then the war happened and these paintings couldn't be sent back. They had ended up in Sydney. The Art Gallery of New South Wales wouldn't show them either. So they were shown in Sydney at the main department stores gallery, David Jones. And then when they were not able to be sent back, they requested that they be stored somewhere. And the Art Gallery of New South Wales took them, but they wouldn't exhibit them. They put them in the basement. At the end of the war, the galleries were offered these paintings at rock bottom prices. So this is 1945, 1946, and they wouldn't buy them. So that's how conservative the art world was at that time. So,
Erica, I have a question. What was it, World War I that sort of wiped out the male artists?
that's what Bernard Smith is saying.
It gave them the women a step up in the art world as
Yeah,
a
well,
result.
that was his understanding of why this happened. And I think it's because they weren't allowed into the lofty male venues. And so they said, well, I'm going to explore. And I'm in a way, it was a kind of freeing of their, they didn't have to adjust to the idea of what the market was going to be, you know.
So you don't fully buy the theory that it was the lack of male artists that gave the women a boost? And just trying to
Well,
follow.
yeah, I mean, why would it be why would it necessarily be that men who were artists um, died and didn't come back? I don't know. It could be part of it. And maybe that's why in England too, it wasn't as, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. But
When was the Boer War in South Africa?
that's the 1890s,
Okay,
1898,
so a
I think.
little earlier. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wondered
Yeah.
if there was a huge loss of men in the Boer War, 'cause I know the Australians sent troops.
Yeah. Oh, well, they really suffered in World War One. That
Yeah,
is true,
yeah.
Gallipoli and
Right,
that.
right.
Um, the other thing is that in Australia, because it's such a masculinist society, culture was seen as women's purview in a lot of ways. Okay, so the men were creating these artworks, but as a kind of I don't know, more superior idea of, we're rendering the national picture, so this is for public. But culture was really considered a woman's purview, there literarily is too, there are lots of women writers, really talented women artists. And there's also the fact that they just were not considered to have culture in a way. And they have this inferiority complex at that time that, you have to go back to England because that's the only place where there really is culture. And a lot of women particularly go to England for that reason. The writer of Mary Poppins is actually an Australian, but she's always seen as a British artist. And Thea Proctor did exhibit. Somebody had asked me before about did they exhibit as British artists or did they define themselves as British? And Thea Proctor was at the Venice Biennale as a British artist in 1912. So yeah, there's always this problem for Australia of identity, of how are we really Australian? What is it to be really Australian?
Mm.
So, okay,
Well, thank
anything
you.
else? Okay, next week we'll be doing Aboriginal art, and I will send you some links to information on that. Okay,
Mm.
got any more
Thank you.
questions?
Wonderful
Okay,
lecture.
thank you.
Thank you.